Welcome to the 5th technique video in this series on adding beads to crochet. The technique in this video is an invention. I haven't seen it in the literature. I like to think somebody else has done this somewhere before. I'll be adding a bead in between stitches. The bead is pre-strung, but I'm also pulling a loop through the bead. Let's get started. I am in double crochet. I've worked my turning chains, so I am at the end of a stitch and ready to start the next stitch. My bead is pre-strung. I will slide my bead up into position. So at this point, this looks a lot like technique number 1, except now I remove my working hook. I get a hook that fits my bead, and it goes left to right through the bead. I get my working loop. The working loop goes through the bead, and then I return to my working hook. And from there, I work my stitch as normal. So that was the first way of doing this. If you can work with your hook that is compatible with your bead, not necessarily the size hook you would choose for the yarn, then you can do it the second way. So I'm using the bead-sized hook. I slide the bead up. This time I pop the hook out, come around, get my loop, and then keep going. So I don't have to swap out hooks. I do, however, have to be mindful of my tension when working my stitch, since this is not the size hook I would use with this yarn. The third method is an ambidextrous method. If you can figure out how to hold a hook in each hand and somehow tension the yarn at the same time, slide the bead up. The bead hook is in your left hand. It goes left to right through the bead. And then you get the loop. And now you pull the loop through the bead, or push or pull the bead through the loop. They are equivalent maneuvers. And then work your stitch. As you can see, none of these three methods are fast. I suppose if this method became popular, maybe someone would invent a gadget you could put on your finger where you could pull the loop through. I don't know. Let's see what we got. The pros and cons of this are very similar to the pros and cons of pre-strung beads. Great if you are in only one color of bead. If you're in multiple colors, you have to string the beads in the correct order. You can't improvise. It's difficult to fix mistakes. You have to plan ahead. Also, because you're pre-stringing, you're pulling yarn through lots of beads, it might cause the yarn to fray and weaken. On the plus side, beads that are pre-strung are not going anywhere. You can put the project in your bag. The project is portable. In double crochet, I got a decidedly horizontal rather than vertical orientation to my bead. And I have 3 strands of yarn going through the bead, because I have the loop and then I have the working yarn. In fact, I might have to shop around to find beads with holes big enough to fit that much yarn through the bead. So very secure. When I turn the work around, it is reversible. On this swatch, I worked single crochet with a bead in between and then a plain row of single crochet, double crochet with a bead in between and then a plain row of double crochet. So this is plain double crochet. It looks like I've got a chain space, but it's just that the beads are pushing the double crochets apart. Notice on the single crochet the bead is angled a little bit, so it's not quite horizontal. It is reversible, although I think it looks just a smidge better on the back side than on the front side. On the front side I got a little bit of yarn here right above the bead, so it's not quite as clean in single crochet. And in fact, one of the things I like about this technique compared to technique number 3 is technique number 3 looked a lot like this, but you got a little piece of yarn under the bead. And here in technique 5 you don't get that. Something else to keep in mind with this, if you are adding a bead between stitches 1 and 2, you see how the bead wants to slide down onto the turning chain. So what I did here is on the return row, I worked that last double crochet into the chains. And that is holding this bead up here with its brethren where it belongs. This technique does have some of the drawbacks that we saw in technique number 3. The bead is on the chain, which means on the next row you have to kind of think about, well, does my hook go here? Does it go over here? You might have to think about it a bit. So I think this technique will be compatible with some stitch patterns, but maybe less compatible with others. And let me show you the second swatch. So here I am working a mesh. This is double crochet, chain 1, double crochet, chain 1, and I've put a bead on that chain 1. And that works pretty well. But if I have a pattern where I needed to work into that chain 1 or I need to work into the space, then I would be going, well, where do I go, or which side of the bead do I use? Now coming back, I put 2 beads on my chain 1, and then when I worked across, I can work in between either by working into the chain or by working into the chain space. So if you don't mind using more beads, that might be a solution depending on the stitch pattern. I think this technique really shines in a couple of situations. When you are at the very end of the project, if you do this on the last row, your beads are going to be very secure, so that would make a lovely beaded edge right at the end. Then you don't care about whether or not you have to work into those chains. And in fact, if you're doing it on the last row, you could work the whole project without stringing the beads, and then string the beads in working order up the back side of the skein, because by that point you're near the end of the skein, you don't have a lot of yarn left. The other way I think this technique is really good, and you may have guessed this from the issue with the first bead sliding down onto the chain, is if you like working loopy chain edges, you chain a bunch, you single crochet, you chain a bunch, you single crochet. This is really lovely. Let me show you what that looks like. So this was a chain 3. This is a chain 5. So let me slide a bunch of beads up towards this. There is a bunch of beads. get my hook. And then see if I can drag the loop through the beads or drag the beads over the loop. They are equivalent maneuvers. So you can chain as many as you like, and then slide as many beads as seems sensible onto the chain. And then single crochet. This is a very bead dominant technique. You don't see much of the yarn. Lots of yarn in between the beads. It's very secure. It is reversible. This is the sort of thing where I think even if it caught on something, you would realize it had caught before the yarn broke and the beads went everywhere. So if you like to add loopy garlands of beads along the edges of things, like maybe shawls, I think this would be a fabulous way to do that. So there you are. That's what happens when you use a hybrid technique to add beads in between stitches. The next video will show you the hybrid technique, but in the middle of making a stitch. See you at the next video. Happy crochet!